Moscow, home to the University of Idaho, seemed like any small college town in America, the type of place you would not think twice about leaving your door unlocked. This illusion was completely shattered in the fall of 2022. In the early morning hours of November 13th, four college students, Madison Mogen, Haley Gonzalez, Ethan Chapin, and Xana Kernodle, were found brutally murdered in an off-campus residence on King Road. For weeks, the tight-knit community and the entire nation was left on edge with seemingly more questions than answers. In a hunt that spanned the entire country, Bryan Kohberger, a PhD student studying criminology at a neighboring university, was eventually arrested in late December all the way in Pennsylvania, extradited back to Idaho, and charged with the murders of all four students. Both the prosecution and defense were gearing up for the trial to begin in August, but in a move that shocked most, Kohberger reversed course and pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. While he will spend the rest of his life in jail, the plea deal effectively took the death penalty off of the table. Today we're speaking to Howard Blum, a journalist and author of When the Night Comes Falling, a Requiem for the Idaho Student Murders. He's been on the ground in Moscow and is here to react to the shock plea deal and to try to make sense of the questions that still remain unanswered. Hi everybody, I'm Brittany Lewis, a host of Forbes TV. Joining me now is Howard Blum, investigative journalist and author of When the Night Comes Falling. Howard, thanks so much for joining me once again.
Nice to speak with you again.
Howard, you and I spoke last year about this case, and there have been certainly a lot of developments between now and then, but this has really been a story that's gripped the entire nation, and you've been covering it from the start. Before dawn on November 13th, 2022, 4 University of Idaho students, Haley Gonzalez, Maddie Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, were brutally murdered at an off-campus home. And over a month after these murders, Bryan Kohberger, who was studying for his PhD in criminology at the nearby Washington State University, was charged. And this case was all set to go to trial in August, but in a shocking twist that surprised mostly everyone, he ended up pleading guilty earlier this month. And we're going to talk about the plea, but as someone who went to Moscow, who's someone who is familiar with this case, you've investigated this for years. I'm curious, A, what drew you to this story? Why did you begin reporting on it? And B, what are some of your takeaways here?
I began looking into this case on Thanksgiving nearly 3 years ago. We were sitting around the table and the talk turned to this perplexing case in Idaho. Horrific. 4 students were killed. There was no clues really at this point. There was no suspect and there was no motive. And I began to talk with my editor the next day and I said, well, I've made a career looking into large mysteries. Why not delve into this one? And he agreed, and I was on the plane the next day. And what I found was to begin with, an interesting town. Moscow, and the locals say you pronounce it Moscow rather than Moscow. They want the name, they say, to rhyme with Costco. That was what they insisted. It's a town that's on one level a university town, a very liberal university town. Is rated as the largest party school in the state, and yet the main populace of the rest of the town is a fundamentalist Christian church. So there's a great deal of tension. But it's a very pretty place, surrounded by hills, rolling land, very pretty, and yet also has a frontier spirit. So I started knocking on doors and trying to put the pieces together. And it was a real puzzle because there were no suspects. The task force was on the case for 7 weeks before they had any real clue. And this one clue allowed them to unravel the case. This clue was that on the night when the murders occurred, the murderer left a knife sheath in the bed of one of the victims. And on that knife sheath, on the button snap of the knife sheath, there was a bit of touched DNA.
And so then here we are today. That knife sheath was a huge piece of evidence because it ultimately was able to connect the investigators to Bryan Kohberger via his father's DNA. So do you think without that knife sheath, if Bryan Kohberger did not leave that behind, we would be sitting here today, he would have pled guilty, he would have even been found or connected to this case at all?
I think, and in my opinion, this is sheer speculation, if Bryan Kohberger knife sheath had not been found, if that DNA had not been on the knife sheath. There was no blood traces from Kohberger anywhere in the house. There was nothing really to connect him at that time. He would still be on the loose today. He would have bought another knife sheath on Amazon. We saw that he was hunting for a new one. The murder weapon has never been found. He wanted a new knife. And I believe he would have killed again. I think he would have had the satisfaction of this one killing, and it would have encouraged him to go out there and try to do it again. All the evidence that the prosecution had really came in the aftermath of this DNA on the knife sheath being indicated. And it was, in many ways, somewhat circumstantial. They had, for example, videos of a white car circling the area 4 different times on the night when the killing occurred. But in all those videos, there's not one shot of the license plate, and there's not one clear photograph of anyone behind the wheel. And there are a lot of white cars in Idaho. Then they had cell phone triangulation that put Kohberger's phone 23 times, the prosecution said, in the vicinity of the murder house, within 100 meters of the murder house in the months before the murders. Well, 100 meters in a town like Moscow, there are a lot of people who live around that area. It's a campus community. And so that really isn't incriminating. They never found the murder weapon. They never found any blood splatters in his apartment, no trail of blood leaving from the murder scene. So this was in many ways a perfect crime, except for the one thing, is leaving the knife sheath behind.
So, can you lay out the prosecution's case a little bit more? Because aside from that knife sheath, a lot of that evidence was circumstantial. There was one witness, Dylan Mortensen, who was one of the roommates in the house. She saw the murderer leave the house. He had bushy eyebrows, but aside from that, she didn't really see much. So, was the prosecution's case that strong? I mean, what were they going to say in court, and how nervous were they, if at all, heading to trial?
The prosecutions had a good case, but it was a circumstantial case except for the DNA, because the DNA on the knife sheath was an exact match from a cheek swab taken from Kohberger. That's pretty incriminating evidence. Then when you created the whole mosaic of the white car in the area, of the cell phone triangulation, of Kohberger, they had Kohberger going online on Amazon, ordering a K-bar knife with a 7-inch steel blade, just like the one that was used. That was, altogether a pretty strong case. And they had rulings from the judge recently that reinforced their case. The Kohberger defense team had a couple of things that they were going to try. For example, there were 2 drops of blood found in the house, one on a banister and another on a glove outside the house, in fact, on the threshold of the entrance to the house. All those 2 spots of blood have been identified solely as male DNA. The Kohberger team was going to say that those spots of blood belonged to the real perpetrators, and that Kohberger was in fact a patsy. And this was his DNA on the knife sheath. However, those perpetrators were the ones who put the knife sheath in the bed. They were the killers. And so they tried this out on the judge. They gave 4 names in a motion. The names had been redacted of who they thought were the actual killers. And the judge looked at this and he said, this isn't evidence. This isn't allegation. This is, in effect, a scurrilous rumor. And he said, you can't bring this into the courtroom.
And there was another strategy the defense was rumored that they were going to try, which was, hey, no, he was just out stargazing at the time of the murder. But as you pointed out before, it was a cloudy night. It was freezing that dawn of November 13th. But was the defense's strategy going to be, hey, we don't have much, so what we're going to do is poke as many holes in the prosecution's story. We're going to try to cast as much reasonable doubt really as possible?
Well, there's an old legal adage. When you have the facts, you pound the facts. When you don't have the facts, you pound the table. And boy, for the past 2.5 years, they were, to their credit, pounding the table. Their large ambition was to save Bryan Kohberger from the firing squad. They wanted to make sure that the death penalty was not inflicted in this case. They wanted to raise reasonable doubt. But in recent weeks, as I said, the alternate perpetrator strategy was dismissed. And then the alibi, that stargazing on a cloudy night, the judge looked at that and he said, quote, "This is not an alibi." He wouldn't allow it to be introduced. So they really had nothing. All they could hope to do was delay, delay, and delay. And with the trial coming up, they'd run out of delays.
And you know a lot of Bryan Kohberger. Your book really goes into the type of person he was from high school to when the murders took place. And it was really shocking when he ended up ultimately pleading guilty because from the start, he said he was innocent. Ann Taylor, his attorney, was saying Bryan Kohberger's innocent. Now he's pleading guilty to all 4 murders, first degree, and 1 count of burglary. But in return, he's in jail for life now, no possibility of parole, but the death penalty is off the table. Based on the Bryan Kohberger you know, are you surprised by this? Because you detail accounts of him thinking he's the smartest person in the room. He's a type of person that needs to get the last word in. He thinks he's the most intelligent. So what do you make of this twist?
I think by this plea deal, Bryan Kohberger sees himself as having the last laugh, actually. Look at his life. He started out as a poor student. He was a heroin addict. He was overweight, and yet he finds the will to transform himself. He transforms himself. He loses 125 pounds, starts working out, turns his body into a fortress. He moves from a community college, a 2-year community college, to a 4-year liberal arts college at the Sal, and then to a distinguished graduate program at Washington State University. He finds the will to kick heroin. He does all these transformative things. And yet, once he gets out to Washington State, he realizes, in effect, biology is destiny. He can't really change who he is. He will always never be able to fit into the real world. And so I believe, and this is speculation, his fascination with crime led him to see if he could commit the perfect crime. And now he got close. He got very close, except for that one mistake. But now when he's in prison, I think after a while he'll be getting bored, and he now will become this forensic psychologist that he always wanted to be. He will be able to talk to other people in the field. He will be a peer with them. They will come to his jail cell. He will give interviews, and he will now expand on how he committed these crimes. He will now become an authority. And I think that would be a very fulfilling life for him. He'll be in a sheltered world, and he'll be able to achieve his ambition of accomplishing something. In his twisted way, I think he's going to come out, I hate to say this, a winner in this case.
And you said before, he's the type of person that was living in the shadows. Even after he kicked heroin, even after he dropped all that weight, he went to a pool party when he first got to Washington State University, and he wasn't being paid really any attention. Witnesses there kind of were creeped out by him. They thought, oh, that's just kind of that weird guy. Some of them were talking to him to be polite. Others were just kind of weirded out by the whole social interaction. And Steve Gonsalves, who is Kaylee Gonsalves's father, agrees with you there. He thinks that Bryan Kohberger is now just going to drip information and interviews, exclusive interviews, once he's in jail now, since he's pleaded guilty. But why now? Why do you think he decided to say, hey, right before this goes to trial, I'm just going to plead guilty? Do you think the defense just believed now he's guilty?
Well, my reporting gave me this insight into what had happened. Earlier on in the case, a couple of months ago, the defense team realized my client's going to wind up in front of a firing squad. So they approached Bryan Kohberger and said, you need to take a plea deal. He called up his mother, and according to the reporting I had, his mother said no. Whether she believed he was innocent, she didn't, or maybe she just didn't want to face the fact that her son was a monster. She said no. So Bryan told his team no plea deal. Then, after the 2 recent rulings that we discussed earlier in June, where they threw out the alibi, they threw out the alternate perpetrator defense, Bryan Kohberger's team approached him again. And now something else had happened. There had been a special, Dateline special, I think it aired in mid-May, I was part of that team, but a very small role. I talked a bit, did a little bit of investigation, but they uncovered one really interesting fact. 2 hours after the murders occurred, at approximately 6 a.m. in the morning, Bryan Kohberger called a phone registered to his father. According to my reporting, he had spoken with his mother for 54 minutes, nearly an hour. And in the course of that conversation, no one knows what was said except Kohberger and whomever he spoke to. However, once this phone call was made public, Kohberger's parents knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that the prosecution had knowledge of this call and that they would bring this call up in the courtroom case. They would have to go on the stand and testify under oath as to what was said and what suspicions they might have had about their son's actions. And when they explained this to their son now began to realize nothing akin to remorse in any way that you and I might understand it, but he did feel something towards his parents, and he did not want to put them in a situation that would jeopardize them legally. So when his defense team came to him and said it's time to cut a deal, he factored in the situation his parents were in, and also the fact that he'd be facing the long guns of a firing squad. And he said, "Well, it makes more sense to try to get a deal." So they approached the prosecution. Why the prosecution gave in, that to me left me stunned. As we said earlier, they were holding all the cards. They had been at this for 2.5 years, and I couldn't quite at first understand why they did this. Yet the more I thought of it, it seemed like the men in power, honorable men in Idaho, had been wanting to move this case away as quickly as possible. I mean, look at the history. The first judge in the case, Judge John Judge, as soon as he could, he moved the case from Moscow to Boise, and then he could have gone with the case. He could have been the presiding judge of the trial. He said, "No, I don't want this," and in fact retired from the bench. Then there was the Police Chief Fry. He led the 7-week manhunt that captured Kohberger. He cried on national television with grief and elation, a mixture of both when Kohberger's arrest was announced. And then, rather perfunctorily, he retired from the police department in Moscow. He now is a police chief in Washington State. He had had enough. And then the University of Idaho itself, what happened to the murder house? They couldn't wait to demolish it. They sent bulldozers in at 6 in the morning, knocked it all down as if they could forget about it. I think honorable men in Idaho just wanted to move on. And the prosecutor, Bill Thompson, who'd been living with this case for 2.5 years, he felt enough is enough. The prospect of a 3-month trial was just too dispiriting. And he just didn't have the appetite to fight. Perhaps he wanted to spend the summer going fishing rather than battling in a courtroom over such a horrific case.
I want to get back to the fact that Bryan Kohberger's parents might have had to take this stand because in your book, I mean, one of the most fascinating elements is you detail this car ride that Bryan Kohberger and his father, Michael, have from Washington State to their home in Pennsylvania, cross-country trip. And Bryan Kohberger's father, Michael, he was concerned enough about his son that he flew out there to make this trip. And throughout your reporting, you say that he was having some thoughts. There was a kernel of doubt in his mind that, hey, maybe my son could potentially have somehow been involved with this. He had this sick feeling in his stomach all throughout the trip across the country. Then you get to their home in Pennsylvania, and his sister, his other daughter, Bryan Kohberger's sister, tells him, hey, I saw Bryan scrubbing out his car with a vacuum with latex gloves on. I saw him digging through the trash and separating the trash, separating his own trash. He also was dumping the trash in his neighbor's can. And Michael Kohberger, the father, kind of ignored this. Was the concern then, if he was on the stand, if the parents were on the stand, they would perjure themselves and say, hey, no, he might have had some troubles in his childhood, but he's a good person, he wouldn't do this? Or the other fact that they could tell the truth and voice their concerns. What do you think was the more likely route there?
I think you raise an interesting point. Let's go back to the trip they take across America. Bryan Kohberger's father, who's 68 years old, flies out to drive back across country with his son just a couple of weeks after the murders. It's an expense for a family. The father was a custodial engineer at a local high school. He had been bankrupt twice, but he feels it's important enough to make this trip with his 28-year-old son that he has to go out there. As soon as he arrives, Michael Kohberger, the father, in Washington State, he begins to realize that his son, something's up. His son's in a keyed up state. He's seen this problematic Bryan before, and he knows to be wary. He also knows that just 9 miles away from where his son is living, 4 young people were horribly murdered. Does he have suspicions at this point? Well, they begin to build. The son changes the route, the way they're going to go home. Twice during the trip, they are stopped by Indiana State Patrolmen in a traffic stop, but there are flashing lights, and his father, in his mind, it's almost as if he's wondering, could they be coming for my son? I mean, it's a moment filled with high drama. And also, they're sitting shoulder to shoulder in a white Hyundai Elantra. And every policeman in the country is looking for a white Hyundai Elantra that's involved in this crime. And here he has his problematic son. So he's putting the pieces together as they drive across country to Pennsylvania. He can't quite get there. It's too large a moment for him to confront directly. And when he gets back to Pennsylvania, and his sister tells him, well, Dad, I think we might have a problem with Bryan. He again, just sort of, according to what I've been told, shrugs and leaves the room. He can't confront it. But if there were a trial, he would have to go on the stand. Other family members would have to go on the stand, and they would have to testify to what they'd seen and what they had heard and what they had thought. And this might have put them in legal jeopardy for not reporting Bryan sooner.
And now there is no trial. Sentencing is on Wednesday, and the reaction from the families of the victims is mixed. Ethan Chapin's family kind of feels like this is closure. They do want to move on. They do want to remember Ethan. And Ethan's mom said, this could be good in the sense of she didn't want the students to be back on the stand, having to be re-traumatized and relive this. The Gonzalez's, though, are very angry about this. Bryan Kohberger didn't even have to say the victims' names when he pleaded guilty. He just said yes and guilty. I mean, do the people of Moscow, based on your reporting, based on what you know, what do they make of this plea deal?
The plea deal is a real, in my opinion, a deeply cynical, pragmatic gesture done very quickly in haste over a weekend. As the parents of the victims feel about it, they're right to whatever they feel will help them get through it. They're right to say, let's move on. They're right to be angry. Who am I to judge? How can you judge people who've just lost their children? They are going to be victims too for the rest of their lives. They are serving life sentences. However, at the same time, I'm baffled by why the prosecution did not demand more from Kohberger, did not have him explain more. They had the right to have him explain things rather than just give these terse, indolent, yes, I did it. Yes. That's not enough. And also the taxpayers of Idaho, they've spent at this point over $4 million. They deserve some sort of answers for that $4 million that were spent. And instead, we're just left with mysteries. We still don't know the motive. We still don't know where the murder weapon is. We still don't know actually how he committed the crimes and got out of the house without leaving a blood trail. But there's so much more we need to know, I think, for this to have any sense of closure, as if there could ever be closure. But I think it's just too hasty. It's just like bulldozing the house by the university authorities. Everyone wants to bulldoze this and move on as if people will forget, but they won't forget.
I did want to talk about that money component because I'm a Forbes reporter, so money facts jump out to me. Millions were spent by the Idaho taxpayers on this case. Is there a sense that this money is wasted? Because even in your afterword, you write that the opposing legal teams squandered time and money in what amounts only to preliminary skirmishes. Because the two questions still remain here, two of the biggest questions. What was the motive? Why did Bryan Kohberger do this? Because there doesn't seem to be a real direct link to him and the victims. And where is the knife? That murder weapon has still yet to be found almost 3 years later.
Well, you raise all the pertinent questions that still linger out there. They hang ominously over this whole case, and we will never get answers. It's deeply frustrating for the people of Idaho, I think, who paid this $4 million and counting. Yes, they got Kohberger sent off to jail for life, and perhaps that's a victory, but I don't think it's very fulfilling unless people can understand this crime, understand what happened. And we have no sense, really. I have my theories of what happened. I believe he targeted just one of the young women, Maddie Mogen, and I can go into that. But again, there's no sense of really deep understanding. How do we deal with this? How do we learn from this? How do we move on from this in a functional way rather than just trying to push it off to the side?
And the Gonzalez family said they want more answers. They want to know what exactly happened to their daughter. They really want to know the why. And last year in our conversation, you said that you believed that there was the target, as you just mentioned now, Maddie Mogen, because he apparently went to that room first on the third floor. Can you talk to us about that? Have you learned anything in the past year that strengthens that theory?
Well, interestingly enough, in the year since we've talked, it seems that the prosecution has reinforced everything I said back then. They too say that there was only one victim, that they said that at the plea hearing. But as I described that night in my book, Kohberger's car circles the house not once, not twice, but 3 times at approximately 4 a.m. Uh, he's not, I believe, staking out the house. He's trying to find the will to act. He keeps on trying to go away, and each time he's pulled back. If he'd been staking out the house, he would have noticed there were 4 cars parked in front. He would have seen the DoorDash delivery driver and realized someone was up. This was not the time to go in. But instead, he finally finds the will to park on a hill of a ridge above the house. He turns off the engine of his car. That requires all his strength. But as soon as he turns off the engine of the car, grabs his knife sheath, opens the door, and walks down this icy slope, he's made up in his mind to become a monster. He enters in, as I originally wrote, through the sliding kitchen door that was left open, was always perpetually left open. He goes in on the second floor. There are 2 bedrooms on the second floor. Each has sleeping students in it, or students who are awake. One was sleeping. He ignores that. He makes a beeline right for this narrow stairwell that goes up to the 3rd floor and goes directly into the bedroom of Maddie Mogen. To his surprise, he finds that Kaylee, her best friend, was sleeping over that night. Now he has to deal with 2 people. Kaylee fights back like a tiger. That, I believe, causes him to leave the knife sheath behind in his confusion. But he had originally gone to kill Maddie. Why had he chosen Maddie? Well, there's no evidence anywhere of any interaction with her. She was a waitress at the Mad Greek restaurant where he had frequented because it had vegetarian and semi-vegan food. Did he ever speak with her? Again, there's none of that. There's no evidence that he ever followed her on social media. But perhaps there was something about her blonde good looks, her exuberance that excited him. He was a man who we've seen who was prone to obsessiveness, prone to passions. And he saw in Maddie the way she was, I believe, a rebuke to his outsider's life. We talked to him at the pool party, not quite fitting in. That was, testimony to the sort of life he led. We've seen body cam footage from the Moscow police that they're responding to noise complaints at the house. And you can see this house full of kids, music blaring, having a good time, drinking lots of cans of hard seltzers all over the lawn. And I could imagine, and I believe this, if we ever know the whole story, it'll be proven true. There's Kohberger in the shadows watching all this, hanging in the distance, an outsider to this sort of fun, that he will never be a part of. He transformed his life completely, and yet he never could transform it to be a functioning human being, to have any sort of relationships or interactions with people. And he felt that Maddie was a rebuke to the sort of life he was living, and he could not live in this world without taking out his resentment on her. And so he targeted her, and everyone else that night became collateral damage, I believe.
And there's still, as you and I have discussed this entire time, so many questions that remain unanswered. But the gag order was lifted mid-July. Do you predict or think that we're going to find out anything, any of these questions will be answered from that?
I think we'll begin to get a steady drip, drip, drip of answers, but will they be the actual truth? I mean, we're going to get people who say they're close to Kohberger beginning some theories. I think Kohberger along the way will share some things. He might be playing with people. He might want to give twisted versions of all this. But I think perhaps his family members will talk at one point. There was talk that his sister was writing a book. We'll see if this happens.
And this case not only horrified a small college town, but really an entire nation. And you spent a lot of time investigating and learning the lives of the four victims: Ethan Chapin, Xana Kernodle, Kaylee Gonzalez, and Maddie Mogen. So we spent a lot of time talking about Bryan Kohberger, but I want to focus on these victims. How do you think we should remember them, and not just the early morning hours of November 13th?
Well, you raise a very important point. I subtitled my book A Requiem for the Idaho Student Murders, and I wanted the book in many ways to be a loving remembrance of the lives they led and the lives they could have led if they hadn't been extinguished so brutally and so early. I mean, these were kids full of potential. These were young, bright, energetic young people that any parent would be proud of. I think of Xana particularly. On her high school graduation, she had on a mortarboard written underneath it, "For the lives I will change." And think about that, for the lives I will change. And now she will never get any opportunity to change those lives. And instead, her life has been cut short. And all we have are memories of these young people. And I talk in the book about their friendships, their ambitions, and all that has just been cut so tragically short. It's very disheartening, dispiriting.
And I mean, Kaylee and Maddie had that sisterhood. Xana and Ethan were just such a young, loving couple based on your reporting, based on what their families have said. They had so much promise ahead of them. And I mean, the whole story is just so tragic. But When the Night Comes Falling, A Requiem for the Idaho Student Murders, is a New York Times bestseller. You just published a paperback version, and that has a new afterword in it. So where can people find the book?
The book is at Amazon, local bookstores, hopefully everywhere. The sales have been very gratifying.
And Howard, what specifically are you looking out for next? We have the sentencing hearing in 2 days now for Bryan Kohberger. What specifically are you looking out for then?
Well, the sentencing hearing should be very dramatic. The parents are finally going to be able to speak. I do know that some of the parents have been struggling to get the facts. Steve Gonsalves, for example, wants to know, is trying to find out how many times was his daughter stabbed. According to some sources, it was as many as 54 times. He wants to look Kohberger in the eye and say this. And I don't know how anyone could find the strength to do that, but we will see. The woman of high drama. But what's also interesting to me is Judge Hippler has the authority, the legal authority, and perhaps the moral authority to ask Kohberger for some answers. Kohberger can answer very tersely, just the way he did at the at the plea hearing. But Hippler could also say, "I'm sorry, that's not sufficient. I want more." And will he do this? I don't think so, but it certainly would be a triumph for justice if Hippler demanded larger answers.
Well, there's certainly a lot to look out for in just this tragic case. Howard Blum, thank you so much for coming on here, for talking about your reporting, providing your insight. You're welcome back anytime.
Thank you. Pleasure to speak with you.